It's an honour to speak after Dr. Pillsbury, who is probably one of the 2 or 3 people in the world who is most authoritative on China and is a deep thinker. And many of the things he says and writes about are wise and right. But I sort of part company. In fact, I start to part company in the leading article in the book where it talks about China's secret strategy to replace America as the global superpower. I mean, why secret? In his book, Dr. Pillsbury describes an episode where a Chinese defector comes to the United States and warns that there is a secret plan to make the Chinese economy as big as that of the United States by the year 2020. It's a big shock, big secret. Well, I mean, I have to tell him that 25 years ago, I was sitting in a multinational company in London, armed with a few statistics, a calculator, and a bit of common sense. And you could work out on the back of an envelope that China was almost certain to become the biggest economy in the world by 2020. It didn't require secrecy to understand that. And there's simple arithmetic, actually. I mean, there are 4 times as many people in China. When China gets to a quarter of American living standards, by definition, it's going to be equivalent in economic size. I mean, why is that a problem? I mean, it should be something we welcome, actually. And a lot of very poor people getting a decent living standards. And, it's basic arithmetic that when China has continued to grow, as it almost certainly will, and it reaches half American living standards, they will have an economy twice as big. And they're going to have to get used to it, and we are. And actually, it's not just China. By the middle of this century, India will also be an economic superpower with a bigger economy than the United States, very probably. So, there is an issue about the current hegemon, the superpower, getting used to the idea that there is another country which will have comparable and potentially significantly more economic heft. I mean, Britain used to be number 1 100 years ago, so we've had a century to get used to sliding down the league table. I think we're now about number 8. We've just been overtaken by Indonesia, but, we get used to these things. And I think the United States, the core of the problem, in many ways, is an inability to get used to this basic fact and to adapt to it, and to accept that China is going to have to be integrated within the rules of the world system, which the United States has led, and led well, to our benefit for the last 70 years. Now, this whole idea of secrecy, I think, cuts across the idea that many of the features of modern China are hidden in plain sight. Now, it's very clear what they're about. It's not hidden. The idea that the Chinese model, which was developed, the modern Chinese model under Deng Xiaoping, it was very clear from the outset that there were 2 very basic principles. The first was the emphasis on stability and security after a century of chaos, the revolution, the civil war, the war, Mao Zedong's madness. Security under an authoritarian one-party state was never hidden. It was always absolutely clear that this was the model that they were going to pursue. And the second aspect was raising Chinese living standards, which was going to happen by importing capitalism into China, which has happened, state capitalism, a big private sector at the top end, under some state control, but with very dynamic capitalist competitive system, and state enterprises with an element of market competition. And the state capitalist model has worked in China. It's been highly successful. It may now run into trouble. They've got a lot of economic problems associated with underconsumption, corporate debt. Well, of course, if they do run into trouble, they'll become like Japan and we no longer worry about them. But actually, the issue which we now face is that if the Chinese model continues to be successful, this combination of rapid growth sustained by a successful capitalist system allied to an authoritarian one-party state, what is the problem in our having to try and live with that? Now, some of you will say, well, democracy, we believe in democracy, why shouldn't China be a democracy? Well, it is a different system, and hitherto, we've accepted that there is a different system. To take a particular issue which concerns the British, which is our residual responsibilities in Hong Kong, and people here are routely very upset, worse than upset, angry that decent people are being bundled off to prison and newspaper editors are being shut down. But I have to say, the Chinese always made it absolutely clear what the red lines were in Hong Kong. When Margaret Thatcher went to negotiate with Deng Xiaoping 40 years ago, he said, look, we could have dealt with Hong Kong the way the Indians dealt with colonial enclaves or Indonesia, sent the army in, problem solved in 24 hours. But they didn't. They were more subtle. They saw advantages in keeping this independent entity. But he said, look, there are certain parameters. You can say what you like, free speech, you can criticize the Communist Party, but if there is violent disorder, we will move in and stop it. And those people in Hong Kong who, in the name of democracy and free speech, started throwing Molotov cocktails at the police and vandalizing their legislature, did their little bit to kill Hong Kong democracy, because it was very clear what the rules of the game were. And the Chinese were not in any way dishonest or unclear about what was permissible. And I think we need to remember that. And similarly, in terms of foreign policy, President Xi's now been there for 10 years. He set out his approach very clearly 10 years ago, and we accepted it. And it was set out in a statement he made in Mexico City. He was asked about, what's your relationship going to be with the West? He said, look, we're not going to export revolution. We're not going to export hungry refugees. We're not going to mess with you. Don't mess with us. And it's a bit crude, but it's very clear how to engage with China, which is to accept, if you want to have a good relationship with them, you respect their principle of territorial integrity and non-interference. And that's the basis on which they've since conducted their foreign affairs. It's why, for example, in the issue of Xinjiang, terrible human rights abuse, I'm quite sure, and the West has taken up a strong position on it. But it's very clear that a lot of other countries in the world buy the Chinese argument. Every single Muslim country of importance, including those that are democratically elected, Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, have lined up on the Chinese side. So that principle of dealing with China, engaging with China, but recognizing the reality that they have a different system and they're not going to countenance interference with their internal politics, that has to be, out of sheer realism, the way we deal with them. So let me just try and bring to a head where I think this leads. I mean, I was part of a government where we did try to engage with China, and our primary motive was economic. And we took the view, and I would still take the view, that it was economically beneficial to Britain and other Western countries to engage economically with China. As a result of what we did, we still have a British steel industry. A Chinese company bought out Tata Steel, and it was going to close. We will have an electric vehicle industry because the Chinese are going to invest heavily in batteries in the northeast of England. Land Rover is a highly successful motor car industry in the West Midlands because of the profits and the sales in China. AstraZeneca, which developed our vaccine, did so on the back of profits and sales in China. British universities, including this one, depend very heavily on 120,000 Chinese students every year paying full commercial fees. The British economy has benefited from our relations with China. And I don't apologize for having negotiated some of those things. But it isn't just parochial. There's a broader picture. Despite all the complaints about Chinese unfair practices, they've actually helped to keep the world monetary system stable. They hold $4 trillion worth of US assets. It was always going to be said that they would use it to sabotage the system and they would go in for currency warfare. Nothing of the kind has happened. They've kept the basic monetary system stable in implicit partnership with the United States. The person who put the boot into the rules-based system, the World Trade Organization, wasn't the Chinese, it was President Trump. Tried to cut it off at the knees, withdrawing support for the WTO. And Michael refers quite fairly to some of the grievances which we have with the Chinese about intellectual property rights. I mean, all countries coming up, developing, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and I have to say, in its early stages, the United States, which based its development stealing intellectual property from Britain. That was how they got going. I mean, that's how countries start. But they've now introduced intellectual property courts. Foreign companies are now winning cases. They're adapting to the demands of a globally responsible economic partner. We complain, we used to negotiate with the Chinese and say, well, you open your market, show that you're willing to reciprocate free trade. And the top of the Western list and the British list was always financial services. And it's worth noting that in the current flurry of activity that's taking place in China on policy, that one of the things that the president has done is to open up China to financial services. Leading Western companies, BlackRock, JP Morgan, are now operating fully owned subsidiaries in China, buying up Chinese shares. You know, they've accepted the obligations of being part of an integrated economic system. But I'll conclude our remark with something that's more important than international trade, which is those common headaches, the economists call international public goods, where countries have to cooperate. You know, pandemics are one example. The other is in Glasgow at the moment, is climate change. And the Chinese are currently being portrayed as the bad guys. And they have very large emissions, of course, but not in actually per capita terms or cumulatively. But yeah, we're not going to solve the climate problem without Chinese cooperation. And they do recognize there is a problem. They've just introduced carbon pricing. They've got the biggest renewable energy industry, the electric vehicle industry in the world. They tried to accelerate the phasing out of coal and then run into power shortages, so they've had to backtrack, but they understand the necessity. But the key point is we're not going to solve this problem unless we work with them on research, common standards, and so on. And you can't do that in a Cold War environment. And just my final point, and I'll just take a minute over this, is the proliferation of nuclear weapons, probably the biggest danger we face at the moment. And there are rogue states, North Korea, Pakistan, potentially Iran. China has influence with all those countries. We don't know how they exercise it. But we could potentially minimize the risks associated with that if we're willing to work with the Chinese. And something even more serious, because of the collapse of conversations with China, a sort of paranoia has now developed, which is leading the Chinese to build up their stock of nuclear weapons. They had a minimum deterrence policy, no first use, was no threat to anybody. Now they fear they're going to be attacked by the United States, so they're building up their nuclear arsenal. I mean, you can argue about who's to blame, but it's got to be stopped. It's very, very dangerous. And you only stop it if you talk to them. And nobody is now talking to them. And we have to engage for our own sakes as well as theirs. So thank you.